next up, we are going to discuss filter mode. So first, I'm going to tell a little bit of what is being filtered, and then I'm going to like which data is being filtered, and then I'm going to discuss what is being filtered on, like which criteria is being used to filter. So there are many filters throughout the tutorials. Like this is, for example, a filter, right? The date selection, the weekday selection, all filters. But in this case, filter mode is specific to the distance page, and it specifically targets this graph right here. That's also why we're going through it now. This graph right here and this data is the thing that's being filtered. Some small data being filtered here, but the most important part is this, that this data right here is being filtered, and as such also the data that this metric is being calculated on. So without paying any attention on what is happening on the background, if you put it to automatic, you can see the chart changes, the metric changes, everything changes. So if we then go to manual, I'm now gonna discuss exactly what is being filtered on. So we know what is being filtered, right? This right here. Now what are we filtering on? That's the next question. I want to show you by a little example. Say for example, right now we have P1 at hour 2 and P2 at hour 6, and the distance is negative 3.2%. So we can put that in. We're on manual input mode for the sake of argument. We can see only 15.3% of the days have a P1 that is further away from the daily open than we currently have, aka there's a very low probability of that P1 P2 flip, because it doesn't happen often that price moves this far from the daily open and then goes back up. So for that you have to watch the previous video if you haven't already, where we discuss the P1 P2 flip. But the important thing to understand now is that we have this distance from daily open to P2, and we can see that 15.3% of days move this far. Have a P1 this far from daily open, negative 3.21% or further, right? So again, low probability of a P1 P2 flip. But here's the ticker. We know some more information. We know that P2 is at hour 6, right? We know P2 is at hour 6. What we could ask ourselves is, well, is there any difference between for how far a P1 is from daily open if it gets put in around hour 6, so to say, So say for example, does it matter when the pivot is being put in? I'm just going to show you by an example to make it clear. So right now we're just looking at all the days we have selected here, all the days. But we know P2 is at hour 6 in our example. I'm doing manual, I'm at look back mode. So if you're confused why this is hour 10, we're looking back in the past. So this is hour 6, right? And what we could say is, well, what would the percentage be if we would filter only on the days that have a P1 around that hour? So let's say hours 3, just the morning hours, let's say 5, 6, 7, and I'm going to explain why I'm selecting these more often. So we had 15.3%, remember that, and now suddenly it's 30%. So we can see that that's a big difference, right? When we were looking at all data, only 15% of days had a P1 further away, so it was very low probability. When we look at only the days that have a P1 around between hours 3 and 12, let's even remove 12, between 3 and 11 is 28. Well, let's keep 12 for a second. It's 30%. So that's double, right? So suddenly we have we can be a lot less confident in saying that P1 will hold. We can still be, it's still an edge in this case, but it's not the same as 15%. Now, why is this such a difference? Well, the reason why there's such a difference is because the time in which the P1 is put in matters for how much distance it is. How much distance there usually is. Let's revisit something when we say price is energy. When the price opens, it needs time to move, right? And the more time it has, the more time has passed, the more time it has to go further away from daily open. So the logical conclusion is, the closer you are to daily open, the less time price has had to move away from daily open, and thus the closer it will generally be to daily open. So the closer you are to daily open in terms of time, right? So the closer you are in terms of time, that also means that the P1 will be closer in terms of distance. Let's dive into that a little bit more by looking at this graph right here. So this graph is important. We're going to take this graph with it. With this graph, you see the average distance between daily open and P1 by P1 hours. So that means which hour of the day puts in a P1. We can see here, for example, that the average distance of the daily open to P1 when a P1 is put in during hour 0 is 0.7%. We can see that at hour 1, this is already 1.4%. And then you go on and you see, for example, here at hour 12, it's already 3%. The orange line is a regression line, which basically shows the relationship between these two axes. So the distance of daily open to, so this on the y-axis is the average distance of P1 to the daily open. And this is the hour. And what it basically shows, the orange line you can see slightly going up, is what we just discussed. It means that the later the hour P1 gets put in, the further away from the daily open that usually is on average. And this is why it's important. So the main takeaway I want you to take off from now is that it matters when the P1 is put in. If it's later in the day, that is generally later on, that is generally with a bigger distance than it is when it's earlier in the day. And that's the reason why you see such a big difference here, because we know, like, if we just look at hour 0, you can see how close that usually is to daily open. So if we just look at hour 0, we can see only 2.1% of days move this far from the daily open. And that is because it just lies closer. It's just way closer to the daily open. The price has less time to move. So we want to filter that out because we know at this point P2 is at hour 6. So we don't need to look at the distance between daily open and P1 when P2 is at or when P1 is being put in at hour 0. We already know that if the P1 P2 flip were to happen in this case, if this were to happen, we know that that would mean that P2 would be put in at hour 6, right? Because we'd have the P1 P2 flip. So we have already seen that taking hour 0 in there heavily biases the metric here, because this is going to give you too conservative of an estimate, because we know P1, if the P1 P2 flip would occur, then again we're trying to estimate the likelihood of a P1 P2 flip as per discussed in the last video. But we know there's we're looking for that P1 P2 flip, and we know that if that P1 P2 flip were to happen, it would not be during hour 0, right? It would be in hour 6. We also know that hour 0 generally puts in a P1 closer to the daily open, but since we know that's not relevant right now, we can say, well, you can say I'm not interested in data days where they were put in a P1 at hour 0. So you can already see if you delete hour 0 that this will probably already change quite a bit. So you can see it already goes to 21%. That's because hour 0 by itself is the most different from all the others. Like these right here, I know they're high up, but you have to understand that P1 hour 16 doesn't happen a lot, right? So this probably happened like a couple of times, and all those couple of times they were far away. So you have to understand that the further you go, probably the less, or well, that's not entirely true, but these don't have much data, right? So I would pay less attention to these, especially to this one. Like this probably happened once or twice. But anyway, we know that, you know, hour 0 generally is closer to the daily open. We know that it won't be the P1 anyway. So we want to filter that out to get a more accurate description of where of the likelihood of P1 holding. So in case you're wondering why suddenly the screen switched so much, that's because this part of the video is being recorded later, because there has been some updates to this filter mode that we're discussing right here. There's been some improvements and feature updates to it. So I'm re-recording this part of the video to make sure you have all the recent information on how the filter mode works. everything you heard past me talk about until now is still relevant, and I'm just going to pick it up here from past me. So thank you, past me. And we were just discussing, or he was just discussing that hour zero is so important, and that's exactly what the filter mode comes into play. So until now, we have been filtering manually, right? Deselecting hour zero or selecting just the morning hours. And I was making a point that hour zero has a significant impact on whether or not, or on this statistic. And I just want to show you how significant and why it is so significant. If you can press these little circles right here, and that will select only the data. So I have 0 and 1 selected now. That will select only the data for days that put in a P1 during hours 0 and 1. And look at that, right? Now you can see how significant it is. This is between 40 and 50% of the data. I think it's 42% to be precise. So that means 42% of the days put in a P1 in between hour, or at either hour 0 or hour 1. So that's very significant. And this is also why the change is so significant if you select or deselect hour 0, because not only can you see it is 50%, you can also see that pretty much all, like almost all, like a very big portion of P1s being put in very close to daily open are almost all during these 2 hours, right? The rest are usually, you can see here, there's way more room, so the non-highlighted for other hours, right? So there's way more distance in between the daily open and the P1. So that gives us two very, very important conclusions. Hours 0 and 1 are very significant because A, it makes up 50% of the data, and B, they generally have the biggest difference compared to all the other hours in terms of distance, right? So these two generally are much closer to the daily open than all the others, and therefore they make way more of an impact than other hours for filtering. So just one example, see here, it's the same data. I mean, we can actually do that now, but you can see hours 0 and 1 selected will give us 66.3%, so everything selected, and not selecting them will give, for the same data, 85.2, which is a difference of 18.9. Now we can do that same exercise here, where, let me first put this, and I always want to emphasize the point where if you deselect hour 0, so we have now 61%, deselect hour 0, this will become 75%, deselect hour 1, they will become 78%, and from now on you will see the impact becomes less, right? Because there's less data and there's less difference. This comes back to it's 82, so it still goes up, right? 83, but less and less. 82, right now it's staying sort of the same. So this is a very important point I'm making, right? That hours 0 and 1 are the most impactful hours in terms of filtering them out or not, and keeping them or not, right? The rest of the data has less of an effect, like or well, if you filter all of them out maybe, but hours 0 and 1 are almost 50% of the data, and they have the biggest difference compared to the rest. Enter conservative filter mode, right? Let me just deselect all of this. This is the reason why conservative filter mode, let me just, so here we have the filter mode right here, and what we can do is conservative filter mode. Basically, what conservative filter mode does is filter out hours 0 and 1 if the current selected pivot has a hour after, or put in the pivot after hour 1. So for example, if we have conservative, I'm just gonna show you by doing. We have now current P2 selected, right? P2 automatic selected right here, which selects this pivot. So right now what it's doing is that it's looking at, okay, when is the P2 hour being put in? It's hour 8. And if that is later than hour 1, it filters out hour 0 and hour 1. Now, the reason for that being is what we discussed earlier, is that we have now P2 at hour 8. We know that if this flip were to happen, it is not going to happen at hour 0 and 1, right? It is later than, the pivot is later than hour 1. So therefore, you know, you could advocate for the filtering out these first two, because, you know, well, if this is going to happen, then it is going to happen from an hour 8. The reason we are filtering for that is because it gives us a more conservative estimate, right? Because we're not looking at, okay, what is the chance of P1 being this far away? We're looking at the chance, okay, what's the chance of P1 being this far away from daily open if it is not put in one of those first 2 hours, which are really, really important. Now, the reason why we are not, for example, filtering on just hour 8, just to answer that question already, you could, for example, say, okay, why don't we just filter on hour 8? And for that, I need to switch back to manual. For example, if I would filter on only hour 8, there is simply not enough data for it. So here, look, you can see it. There is not enough data, and therefore it doesn't make sense to filter on just hour 8 because, yeah, this will give you 80%, but how reliable is it, right? You're talking about maybe 10 data points here on the left. So it's not reliable to filter on hours 8. In the same way, it is much less reliable because you could also say, okay, but you know, that makes sense, but why hours 0 and 1? Why not have a cluster, which is actually the thing that got updated because we used to have this, where you say, for example, I look at only afternoon hours or morning hours, as past me just did in the video you were watching until now, or until present me took over. So you can say this as well. Well, it's because it's the same problem. You dilute the data by quite a lot, and not only that, as I have pointed out earlier, so you can see this is very similar to what we had when we had the first 3 hours unselected. The further you get in the day, the less impact the sub-selection has, right? So selecting just hours 12 to 19 does not have that much more of an impact on the statistics. Like our deselecting hours 0, 1, and 2 had a big impact, right? We went from 61% to, so once again, to 78%, right? And selecting the afternoon hours, what we got? 83% or something? So only a couple of percent more. So the impact becomes less, and that means you're making a trade-off here, right? So creating more groups, except for just hours 0 and 1, doesn't make a lot of sense in that trade-off, because the trade-off is accuracy versus statistical significance. So what you're doing by creating more groups is that you are reducing statistical significance, right? Because you're working with less data points, and you are only marginally increasing accuracy of statistics. The biggest increase in accuracy is achieved by selecting or deselecting hours 0 or 1 or not. And this is the reason why conservative filter mode only filters out hours 0 and 1, right? So this name is conservative because what it does is increases the value of this, right? And as you know, we use this value to determine the likelihood of a P1, P2 flip. And obviously, I mean, right now it's not very low to begin with, but 61% would give us, well, not a lot of confidence that P1 will hold, but just for the sake of argument, it is more than 78%, right? So this is less confident for us. So this is conservative because generally speaking, this will give a higher value than if you include the manual ones or include all the filters. So therefore, this is called conservative because we simply have a more conservative estimate or derived probability of whether P1 will hold or not. It's good to note that if I select, for example, the current P1, then it will take the current P1 hour. The current P1 hour. Right? So in this case, it is the same. So therefore, it will also at the same as in it's also after hour 1, so it will also filter out hour 0 and 1. We could see if we can find a asset that has hour 0. Let me just quickly check because I do want to make something clear. Not that one. Let me check. Rune. I think Rune. That's a good one. There we go. So this is what I'm looking for. P1, it's hour 0. And then you can see that conservative filter mode does not apply any filtering, right? It includes hour 0 and 1. And in this case, you know, this is just for the sake of argument, because obviously we're not going to use P1 automatic to determine the likelihood of P1, P2 flip. I'm just showing you this, that if your selected pivot is hour 0 or hour 1, it is not going to filter out any data. So if your current P2 is put in hour 0 or hour 1, then no data is being filtered, all data is being included. All data is being included, it's important to note, which means that filter mode conservative only has a difference when your selected pivot is put in after hour 1, so, right? So now it filters it out. That means it only has an effect when your current pivot is after hour 1. And if it is P2 is put in during hour 0 or 1, which happens, doesn't happen a lot, but especially early in the day, obviously it happens, then it acts exactly the same way as manual filter mode, right? So that you can see that if we have P1 automatic selected, manual will give us 78.6, conservative will also give us 78.6%, because simply nothing is being filtered, because, well, in this case P1 is hour 0, but if you have P2, it's the same thing, right? So it's very good to note that conservative filter mode has an effect on the statistics if the current P2 is at hour 2, I have to say, or later. And once again, that is because what we're doing is that instead of saying like, okay, what is the chance that, or how far from daily open is P1 usually in this area, what we're saying is, well, we know that in this area, usually it is much closer. This happens 40 to 50% of the time. And those 40-50% of the time usually are much closer to daily open. Current P2 is hour 8, which is after, you know, this high probability area. So if we were to do the flip, then it's gonna happen from a later hour. So what we're asking is, okay, what is the what we're trying to derive is, right, because it's a derived probability, is what is the probability of that P1, P2 flip happening if it happens after hour 1, so within this area, right? Rather than saying where would that P1, P2 flip usually happen? What are the odds of that happening in this area? We're asking what are the odds of that happening within this area? And once again, the reason why we're just excluding hour 0 and 1 is because they are the most significant, they have the biggest impact, and they happen the most often. And if you would create more groups, then you would just sacrifice statistical significance and only marginally increasing accuracy. So this is more or less the best balance you can find for it. Now you might be wondering, okay, so I will always use conservative. Yes, it is an idea to always use conservative, but there's actually also a case to be made to use manual. They have different implications and nuances, but I want to save that for a future video because that actually has some explaining. But if you want to be safe, just go for conservative for now. But there's actually a good case to be made for no filtering at all. But again, I'm going to dive into that in a future video. If you're watching this right after I uploaded this video, it might not be released yet, but I will be releasing it soon. But chances are very good that it's already online by the time you're watching this. So the implications of the advantages and disadvantages of both methods and when to use it and when not to use it will become clear in that later video. Conservative is definitely a good way to go because by the name you just have more conservative estimates, right? So you're generally on the safer side. And this one is going to give you a little bit more aggressive, as you can see, you know, 5.9% against 10.6%. So this one is going to be a little bit more aggressive. We're going to give you earlier signals. But once again, I'll dive into that in depth in the next video. For now, I want to close off with saying that the weekly does not have any filtering. So there's no filtering method you can do on the weekly. The reason for that being is that it would simply dilute the data too much. Also, you can see there's not much difference in between days of the week because a day by itself has a lot of room to go, right? So there's less difference in the distance between P1 and the weekly open. But the main reason is that, look, if you delete Monday, how little data you have left. So you just sacrifice statistical significance too much. The 8-hour does have, the 8-hour, 4-hour, and 1-hour all have this filter method. The good thing to note is that in this case, the 8-hour conservative filter method only filters out the first block. The reason for that being is the same. It has this first block alone has more or less 50% of the data. Wait, let me just set that to manual. So if you press just this one here, the first hourly block within 8 hours has, almost more than 50% of the data by the looks of it. So filtering out this first one is enough, and this makes sense, right? Because we have 8 time blocks instead of 24, as in with the daily. 4 hours, a similar story. Conservative only filters out the first block for the very same reason. You can see that here. Almost 50%, pretty much 50% of the data. And finally, the 1 hour does exactly the same. It filters out only the first 5 minutes for, once again, the same reason. It has the biggest impact, and it is more or less 50% of the data. So I hope that makes sense what conservative filtering method does. Once again, I understand I haven't really dove very deep into the advantages, disadvantages, and so, but I think the main advantage is already clear. It's going to give you a more conservative estimate, because we know that if the P1, P2 flip were to happen today, it's not going to happen from one of these right here, which are generally closer. So we could say, well, we're going to discard those. And what that basically is telling us is, well, if it was to happen from, or what is the probability of that happening when it happens later than hour 1? And it will give us a more conservative estimate, right? So generally speaking, we'll be on the safer side. But there are more nuances to it. And like I said, there's a case to be made to use manual. And I'm going to explain all that in the next video. So I'll see you there.